Well, welcome. It's great to see all of you here. I'm Ben Hill. I'm with ATDC, which is Georgia Tech's new venture technology program, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Clean Energy Southeast Clean Energy Speaker Series. The purpose of the Clean Energy Speaker Series is to look at demand for energy and power in the Southeast for the next 20 years and to provide solutions and address the supply side of energy and power for the next 20 years. Today's program is Southeast Biomass, highest and best use. And in today's program, we're going to look at resources, economics, and business models. This is the first of a two-part series. On March the 31st, Wednesday, March the 31st, we'll have the follow-on to this, where we'll look at public policy and project financing for biomass. I'd like to take a couple minutes and introduce some of our distinguished visitors today. We're very fortunate to have with us Senator Sam Nunn in the audience. Glad you're here, Senator. I think there's also maybe someone from the Public Service Commission who is present, and then maybe there's another elected official who's present as well. So we'd like to welcome all of you here and also encourage you to invite your staffs to participate in this series, because I think it's pretty informative. I'd also like to recognize the sponsors of this series who are making this possible. Sutherland, a large major law firm of 400-plus lawyers with co-headquarters here in Atlanta and an active clean energy, renewable energy practice, is a sponsor. Georgia Tech's Enterprise Innovation Institute, which is Tech's economic development arm, is a sponsor. The Georgia Tech Strategic Energy Institute, the Brooke Byers Institute for Sustainable Systems, and the Georgia Tech Office of Sustainability are also supporters of this program. In addition to those organizations, we've got a great group of advisors who are making this whole series possible. I'd like to introduce our advisors. Marilyn Brown, who's a professor of public policy and a distinguished professor from Oak Ridge National Labs. Valerie Thomas, who's a speaker today, who is the Anderson Interface Chair at the School of Industrial Engineering and has a joint appointment with Public Policy. David Scholl, who could not be with us today, he's a Tenenbaum Chair and the Georgia Research Alliance Eminent Scholar in Sustainable Energy. Jay Hakes, who is the Director of the Carter Center and the former administrator of the Energy Information Administration, is also an advisor. And then we have two new advisors, Deepak Devan, who is a professor in the College of Electrical and Computer Engineering and is also the director of the Intelligent Power Infrastructure Consortium, i.e. the smart grid. And then we also have Ken Ostrowski, who's a director of McKinsey & Company, who's the head of the North American Energy and Natural Gas Practice for McKinsey, is an advisor. So we've got an incredible group of advisors who are making this whole program series possible. I'd like to thank them for their participation. After the presentations, the format of the program is we'll have some presentations and then there'll be a Q&A session. For those of you participating over the web, through the webcast, should you have questions, please email those questions to me at ben.hill@georgiatech.edu. That's ben.hill@gatech, GATECH.edu. And I will provide those questions to the panel. In addition, check out our website, secleanenergy.org, where all the presentations are deposited after the program, and the webcast, there's a link to the webcast of all this whole program series. So Let's see if there's anything else. Just a reminder that the next program is Wednesday, March the 31st, and please feel free to share spread the word about this program series among your colleagues. Now I'd like to introduce Tom Warren Sutherland, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Sutherland is proud to be a sponsor of the speaker series. Sutherland is a law firm. We are based in Atlanta and Washington, D.C. We also have offices in Houston and New York and Austin, Texas. We have over 60 lawyers in our firm-wide energy practice, including a significant renewable energy practice, in which, among other things, we represent in the biofuels and biomass power area. We represent developers, off-takers, financiers, and others in a number of biomass and biofuels projects throughout the United States. We're very pleased to be a sponsor of the program. I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce our four speakers today. First will be Valerie Thomas, who's going to start off with an assessment of the biomass resource in Georgia. Valerie is here at Georgia Tech. She is the Anderson Interface Associate Professor of Natural Systems. She works, among other things, on energy, environmental, and economic implications of biomass and other energy systems. And her work includes an assessment of alternative aviation fuels for the U.S. Air Force, an assessment of algal biofuels, and an assessment of bioenergy resources in Georgia. She's a member of the U.S. EPA Science Advisory Board and a fellow of the American Physical Society. Following her will be Marie Walsh, who will speak on the economics of biomass in the Southeast. Marie is an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Tennessee, and she's also the head of M&E Biomass, which is a private consulting firm. She was formerly a research staff economist for the Department of Energy Biomass Feedstock Development Program at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where major projects included, among others, the development of a county-level database of biomass feedstock supply and the economic impacts of using biomass for co-firing in the Southeast. Third in our lineup will be Nathan McClure. He will speak on forestry resources in the state of Georgia. Nathan is the leader of the Georgia Forestry Commission's Forest Utilization Marketing and Development Program, and he's also the Director of Forest Energy and Development for that agency. He serves as a member of the Society of American Foresters Climate Change and Carbon Sequestration Task Force and received the SAF National Field Forester Award in 2005. The last member of our panel is Mike Burnside. Mike Burnside is going to speak on the approach to commercialization of the biofuels resources for fuel production in the Southeast. Mike is the president and CEO of Catchlight Energy, which is a joint venture of Chevron and Weyerhaeuser. And prior to being appointed as CEO of Catchlight, he worked for 33 years for Chevron, most recently as a project manager to establish the joint venture. I have the pleasure of starting off with Valerie Thomas.
Thank you. Okay, I am going to raise, probably not completely answer, but at least raise three questions. Is there a lot? Enough to make this interesting enough to keep talking about it? Can it be cost effective? And can it actually be positive for the economy of the Southeast? Biomass, to get just slightly technical for a minute, has, roughly 15 megajoules per kilogram if it's dry. And what that means is it's got about half the amount of energy on a weight basis as coal. You need twice as much biomass as coal to get the same amount of energy. It's up to you to decide what enough might mean, but just to get a sense of scale, I thought, well, let's just look at everything that the state of Georgia uses. We use about 3 or so exajoules. That's about 3,000 trillion BTUs. And that's everything in Georgia. That's the transportation fuel, that's the coal, that's the natural gas, that's the nuclear. And if you look closely here, you'll see there's a 6% there that's actually biomass, which is fantastic. 6% of the energy used in the state of Georgia is biomass already. But just to get a sense of scale, if we were just going to convert all of that and say, you know, let's just pretend it could all be biomass, well, that would be about 200 or so million tons of dry biomass. I'm not at all suggesting that the entire state of Georgia would be converted to biomass, but what would be a big, kind of a big result? Maybe the state of Georgia could get another 10% of its energy from biomass, 10 or 15%, something like that. So we'd need maybe 30 million tons of dry biomass, just to make it really big. Could we do that? Right now, in the state of Georgia, we remove from the forest around 30 million tons or so of dry biomass a year. Of course, we remove that, and we use it for various purposes, some of which actually ends up being used for energy, as I just discussed. So the question is really, if we're looking at forest biomass, could we either get an additional 30 million tons or so, or are there ways to use some of this biomass more efficiently so that it could be both used economically and we could get more energy from this biomass that might eventually, in sum, from a number of different activities, get up around 30. Or, of course, getting even 5% more of Georgia's biomass, and by analogy with the other states in the southeast, that would be something quite impressive too. But those are the kind of numbers that we're thinking about. So it's obvious, just with 1 or 2 minutes of thought, that regardless of your evaluation of the state of forestry in Georgia, it's not going to be producing 10 times the amount of biomass it is now. So there's a lot of biomass, but there's not so much that we can waste it. Forest biomass is not the only opportunity. There is a lot of work being done in crop-type biomass feedstocks, and I think there will be more discussion of that. I don't have an estimate for you today, but that also can be added as an opportunity. Could it be cost-effective as an energy source? There are different ways of using biomass. One way might be to think of using biomass in ways similar to the way coal is currently used. Coal, cost varies. The cost of coal in the southeast in Georgia is actually fairly expensive because a lot of our coal is transported a long distance. So it's more expensive than in other states, and it varies. Even so, even though we have a lot of local biomass, coal is cheaper than biomass. Just pretty much, unless you're very clever, which of course many people are. Coal is cheaper. So no, if just on a raw cost basis to use biomass to make electricity rather than coal, well, it's probably going to cost some more. Unless you can be very smart, which of course we all hope to be. By the way, I just want to add, these are costs for dollars per million BTU. What's shown there in the hand is not a million BTUs. That's actually about 1% of a million BTUs. So that's 2 or 3 cents worth of fuel. Now, some people have suggested that the price of emissions of carbon dioxide might be included in energy costs in the future if we have a price on carbon. That could change things. Although combusting coal and combusting biomass, they both release carbon because they're both based on carbon. The biofuel essentially counts as almost close to a zero emission because, of course, there's emission when you burn that biofuel, but when the biofuel was grown, it took carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So more or less, you've got a kind of zero net situation. That, of course, is true also for the coal, but the coal grew much longer ago, so we count it as just a net emission. So if you priced greenhouse gas emissions, then the price of coal would increase and the price of biomass might not increase at all. And we've actually done some rather detailed estimates of this. Seth Boren, sitting in the audience, is one of the authors, and Todd Levin, who may also be here, of looking really in detail at what would it cost for new electric plants. And not only does biomass have the problem that it costs a bit more, but actually, when we just look at real estimates of real plants that people are putting in, the biomass plants are costing more. We guess that's because they're smaller scale, so kind of per kilowatt hour produced, it's more. So we come up with, yes, it's more to make electricity from biomass. This, I must add, is for new plants. If you want to use biomass in an older plant, then you could save some money. And here are the details of our analysis, which you don't want to see now, but there is. I got that one right. So there are the costs of all of these new power plants. There's a lot of uncertainty. Some people build more expensive plants than others. But so we've shown these bands here, actually. This is Seth Boren, who I believe drew this, who's right here in the audience. This is his work. But the band for biomass is the top one. And more or less, if the price of carbon comes up around, say, $30 to $40 a ton, then coal and biomass cost about the same, even building these small biomass plants that are really more expensive than a big coal plant. So the price could be comparable in the future. Heat is somewhat different. In the Southeast, using biomass for heat has not, for residential heat, has not really been discussed very much, but in Europe, it's not only discussed but used. And there are lots of ways you can use biomass for heat. One way is wood pellets. These days, the price of natural gas at a house and pellets, they're close. Still, pellets are a little more, but not that much more. Now, if you want to make transportation fuel from biomass, first of all, we have an expert who will speak later, but there's not much experience, so there's not much cost data. But at least you can think about, all right, if you're going to take some biomass and you're going to make some fuel, how much is the biomass part going to be? There's also the part of the whole conversion process, which might be quite a bit more, but just what's the fuel cost? The fuel cost of that biomass, how does that translate into a, dollars per gallon? The fuel, the contribution of fuel to, say, a gallon of transportation fuel, if you could buy that biomass at $45 per ton, which maybe you couldn't. Maybe it would be more. Maybe it would be $90 or something. But if it was $45, then interestingly, that contributes 45 cents per gallon. That's just the cost of the fuel. We will learn later, or maybe much later, what are the other costs going into actually creating fuel from biomass, which will be quite extensive. But all this shows you is that since we're expecting that at least a biofuel would cost maybe $3 a gallon and probably quite a bit more, maybe $5, that the fuel per se may not be the lion's share of that cost. So it's interesting, and it's an open question how the economics will work out. Last point that I want to raise, can bioenergy contribute overall net positive value to the economy of the Southeast? This, I don't know if you can see it, it says on there in very worn out writing, Valdosta Paper, which I believe is a company no longer in business. And then over the top of that, there's, I guess, if you're far enough away, you might be able to see it. There's a candy company that then used that. And then in the back, however, there's an industrial facility. So there's a sense of, there have been businesses that are no longer existing in the Southeast that have used biomass, and this is an ongoing process. So there are 2 issues very strongly related to this economic development. One is that there are other, the bottom point there are other existing uses of this biomass. Concern has been raised that if there's a big market for biomass for energy, that could raise the cost of the inputs for some of these other businesses that are not operating on big margins now. Another issue is that there are kind of diseconomies of scale with biomass. Coal, typically transported by rail, that's very efficient. Natural gas by pipeline, that's even more efficient. Biomass is transported in trucks. So it's expensive to move it. And then in any facility, if it's coming in by trucks, there are a lot of trucks, it can be a problem. So one way to think about this that I would offer is actually think small for bioelectricity, possibly. Thinking small, and on the other hand, as I start out, we are interested in bioenergy if it's going to be a big contributor, at least big in some definition of our whole energy picture, 5 or 10%. So if you're thinking small, then that also means you have to think many, many small facilities. It's been suggested that perhaps neighborhood scale facilities could be effective at, say, the 1 megawatt, the 10 megawatt level. Well, that would require thousands, tens of thousands of facilities. Small could be a strategy. It would mean that the technology of working with biomass might not be quite as small scale as, say, residential natural gas use, where everyone has their own private furnace. It could be 3 orders of magnitude bigger than that, but not similar to, say, a nuclear power generating facility that's on the gigawatt scale. So this question of scale is important, and bigger scale is not obviously the solution, although it may be. And another advantage of smaller scale is the potential to use both the heat value, the waste heat, in a sense, from electricity production and potentially get more energy value from the same fuel, which might involve building district heating and combined heat and power into cities and communities. Approach 2 would be not just to try to avoid the problem that there are other biomass users in the Southeast, but actually take advantage of the fantastic infrastructure that the Southeast already has for managing biomass and using biomass not only for other products, but also for energy. And to consider that there might be potential to use or enhance the existing infrastructure while developing energy systems. And in fact, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of electricity generated from biomass already in the state, and it's between 300 and 400 megawatts. Not tiny, especially compared to the concept of making little tiny 1 or 10 megawatt facilities for neighborhoods. We've already got lots of facilities that are producing on the range of 30 or so megawatts already. What might be the potential for expanding this kind of system, either to use more biomass or maybe use the biomass more efficiently, maybe more efficient, more use of electricity that could be exported locally, and so on. These facilities are already receiving and managing the biomass on the trucks. The infrastructure is there, and they know what they're doing. My final slide is just to show that this is not an original idea of mine. People have actually realized that this could be smart. An example is PCA Valdosta in the state of Georgia, which is upgrading I will get it exactly wrong if I try to say what their products are, but it is, I think it's container board? Liner board. Okay, I was very close. They are upgrading their energy system at a cost, bottom bullet, around $2,000 per kilowatt, which, if you were very sharp, you will remember is actually much less than the cost of new generation at regular power plants. they're not going to use any more biomass. They're going to use the same amount of biomass that they've been using before, and they're going to get an extra 50 megawatts. Can they really do it that cheaply? I don't know. If it's twice as expensive, it would still make sense compared to other new generation. Are there other opportunities like that in the Southeast that could be good for existing industry, get a lot more power, and not even use maybe any more biomass? I will end my remarks here and turn to the next speaker. There's a question right here. Do we do questions later?
Afterwards. We'll do questions.
Well, good afternoon. I'm going to take a little bit different approach than I think most of the others, and I'm going to kind of present my presentation as a macroeconomic look at biomass resources. And we're going to talk a little bit about supply curves for these resources. And I know when I say that, I can just see eyes kind of glassing over in the audience, and the perception is, well, that's a nice little academic exercise, but what has this got to do with me? And I want to say it actually maybe has more to do with you than you might think, and that's because right now biomass is not being driven by technology or favorable economics. It's being driven by policy. And to create policy at the national level, there is obviously a lot of input from a lot of different players. Much of it is qualitative, some of it is quantitative. Among the quantitative, it may be a fairly simple back-of-the-envelope calculation, but there are a number of groups who are participating in these discussions that are doing some pretty heavy-duty economic analysis. And to do this kind of modeling, you have to have biomass supply curves. In other words, you have to have information on all of the major feedstocks that are potentially available. You have to have it for the U.S. and disaggregate it to different regions in the U.S. You have to know how much is available, what's it going to cost me to get these feedstocks, and when is it going to be available. It's not enough to know today. I need to know 10, 20, 30 years in the future and have a projection as to what I think it's going to be. So you need to have the supply curve analysis, and I want to say that much of the work that myself and my colleagues at UT have been done is being used by many of these players, and these are just some of the ones that are actually getting their biomass supply curves that they're putting into their models that they're going for biomass for discussions at policy and national level. Additionally, when you do this kind of analysis, you have the opportunity to look at a different set of questions than if you're just looking at a single facility, particularly issues of competition and dynamic interactions between different groups. And so I want to talk just a little about that. So basically, I want to talk a little bit about how much biomass is available and at what cost. How much product in terms of power and fuels can you actually produce from that? And then talk a little about competition. Just a couple of caveats. I'm going to limit my discussion strictly to the major lignocellulose feedstocks. There's a lot of other feedstocks potentially out there, but the focus is on just a handful mostly. And the analysis I'm going to give you are what I would call boundary conditions. So it is more or less a maximum supply and a minimum price. So it's not actually the delivery price you pay, it's the floor price that the supplier can recoup their collection or production costs, but they don't get a profit. It doesn't include any transportation costs in it, on it. So you have to add those to it as well. And I do have, for anybody who might be interested, there is documentation on this. If you're interested, I'll send you a copy of the paper. Now, I've broken all the rules. Every one of the slides I have is going to have way too much information on it, but it's designed that if you're really interested, it's on the website. You can go pull it off and look at it. I'm not going to talk about every single one of these, but what I do want to talk about is a couple. This group down here are the major feedstocks that people are interested. So obviously we're looking at forest residues, that's logging residues, other removals, pre-commercial thinnings, those kinds of things, mill residues, yard trim, Urban waste has always been considered as a feedstock, but almost all of the legislation limits urban waste to yard trim. So construction and demolition wastes are no longer kind of on the table right now. And then agricultural residues, mainly corn stover and wheat straw, are the two major ones. And then dedicated energy crops. We've looked the most at switchgrass. As Valerie indicated, there are others, including short rotation woody crops, other grasses. But I'm going to talk about switchgrass since that's what we've done the most on. If you look at this, you will note the second column that there is a fair amount of material that is generated. But when you look out as to how much we can take at a break-even price at $75, it's considerably less than is generated. Particularly the mill residues, we actually have a lot of mill residues, even though according to the Forest Service, only 1.3 million tons is not currently used. I'm an economist. My attitude is just because it's being used does not mean it cannot be available for bioenergy. Just means you have to pay a much higher price to get it. And so we try to estimate, and that's why we come up with much higher value for mill residues to potentially be available. Additionally, for the corn stover and wheat straw, take a look at how much is generated, how much is available at a high price. And the reason for this is that these residues play a significant role in controlling erosion and adding carbon to the soil, so they're important to maintaining the long-term health and productivity of soils. So you simply can't take it all off. You have to limit how much you can do. As you can see, it depends on kind of management, crop, soil types, etc., but it really drops it down. Now, you can improve over time by changing your management practices in agriculture, i.e. shifting to a no-till application, but that requires new equipment and new ways of doing things than what many farmers are currently accustomed to. Switchgrass, let's be honest, we don't have switchgrass currently. I'd love to say I got millions of acres of this stuff. I've got probably at best 10,000 acres in the United States that's actually in production on it. So this is based on an estimate on how competitive can switchgrass be with the current uses for the land. And so those estimates are based on that break even. Short term, we had a fair amount. But look at what happens over the long term. Switchgrass and probably other dedicated energy crops over the next 10 years could potentially become the biggest source of biomass supply if we start to actually develop those crops. This is kind of summarizes graphically. Geographically, it shows what it is. No surprise to anyone in this room, forestry is big in the South. Corn stover, big in the Midwest. Might surprise you is right here. Notice right in here. The heart of the Midwest, no switchgrass. Grows pretty well there, but doesn't compete particularly well with corn and soybeans. The bar is pretty high. So at a reasonable price, it's a tough go in these areas. More the rest of the country is where it looks good. Well, let's look at the South on it. And I picked 11 states in the South. Again, this is for your pleasure to go back and read. We're not going through all of this kind of stuff. What I do want to say is this last row along the bottom here. Note, of the potential total amount of forest residues available in the United States, about 2/3 of them are actually in the Southeast. So that's a pretty important feedstock for the Southeast, and one where the Southeast has an awful lot of competitive advantage. Furthermore, it's mostly on the lower price end. Higher prices, you start getting other regions coming in, but Southeast looks good at the low price end. Similarly for switchgrass. Take a look here at our projections on switchgrass. Really high projections out over time. And again, we're looking at potentially at the low end. Again, switchgrass looks very good in the Southeast. Southeast really has a comparative advantage in trying to grow a crop like this compared to other crops. So this is another feedstock. You would note I don't have agricultural residues, and that's because that's not a feedstock that's going to be a very viable feedstock in the Southeast. In fact, we only estimate under 4 million tons by 2020 as potentially being available, and that's only about 2% of the national quantity. So that's probably not the feedstock in the South. You just kind of look at kind of the distribution. Well, this is all very nice and good that we've got all of this biomass resource. What can I do with it? How much material can I actually produce in terms of fuels, electricity? So let me just kind of give you a breakdown. First of all, I typically see a lot of studies out there say, well, we don't have enough biomass resources to meet the renewable fuel standard, which says by 2020 we have to have 10.5 billion gallons of ethanol from lignocellulose, and by 2 years later, that jumps up to 16 billion gallons. We don't have enough. I would disagree. I mean, I think the potential out there is to do it. The resources are available to produce those kinds of levels, even at relatively modest conversion efficiencies. But I think, as Valerie kind of pointed out, it's probably going to be a lot more expensive than a lot of people think it's going to be. It's not the lack of resources, is more the cost structure of what it's going to look at. I think it's also important to kind of look at where it's going to come from. And many people would say, well, it's going to come out of ag residues, and that's your first choice. And if you look at this, even at a reasonable conversion rate of 80 gallons per ton, which is actually fairly high, you simply are not really going to have enough ag resources to meet that quantity. So you're going to have to go beyond agricultural resources, I think, because this analysis says 100% of the resources that we estimate available is going to go into these products. That's pretty unrealistic that you're going to be able to get 100% of the available resources. So the bottom line is agricultural residues, corn starch, wheat straw, are probably not going to be enough. So the next thing you can bring in is, if you want to still do it with residues, you start bringing in forest residues. And you look at the combination then as to what you can do in terms of forest residues. It's kind of marginal, to be honest. It looks like there's enough, but again, it assumes that 100% of all these residues are being used and collected. It's probably not the case. So if you really want to have any wiggle room at all, you've got to go to an energy crop. You start bringing in the energy crops, now you've got potential here to significantly exceed the RFS standard. So instead of, and I think my view is, I often see the strategy for this is that it is going to be a sequential. You've got corn, then you've got residues, then you've got energy crops. And I would say I don't think that's a realistic scenario. These are going to be going in parallel tracks. It is going to be simultaneous. You're not going to be relying strictly on the ag residues. You need to be getting, I think, the energy crops up and going pretty quickly if you really want to start meeting these targets. Well, what if I use that residue and all of those resources instead of ethanol? I use it to produce electricity. And I know all you electricity people are probably saying that this is too conservative of an assumption. It's probably a conversion rate that's a little more consistent with co-firing than a dedicated high-efficiency boiler or burner. But if I did, and I converted it and I used it for electricity generation instead, well, how much electricity could I produce? And for the U.S. as a whole, and even for the South, it's about 18% of current generation and projected generation in over the next 10 years. So a fairly significant amount, but if you look at many of the policies that are out there, they're actually talking about higher values than that. And you have to recognize that, oh gee, you've got simultaneously electricity, power, or the electricity, fuels, and a whole range of bioproducts. They're also going after the same set of biomass resources. So now you start kind of wondering, do I have enough to do them all? Are there opportunities, as Valerie said, not only to produce efficiency, but to do some of these things simultaneously, like the chemical conversion of lignocellulose material can also generate electricity simultaneously. So there may be some other ways, but you're starting to get into some areas when you've got really high electricity demands, very high fuel demands, very high product demands. Now you're going to start running into problems of, do I have enough resources to do it? This I won't go into. We just kind of looked at the resources we had and kind of identified what counties actually had enough resources to support different sized plants. As Valerie said, it kind of, you're trucking these things around, and so they need to be kind of close in, and so you want to kind of understand where they are. And the other thing I want to talk just a little bit about is competition. We've always kind of raised the issue with all of these, bioproducts, biofuels, bioelectricity, all going after the same set of resources. Additionally, all of the current uses are still needing to use those resources as well. So you've got kind of competition for the resource itself. You also may have, as Valerie mentioned, competition for some of the inputs, including land. Let me just give you a couple of examples and can close it up here. This is a study that we looked at corn stover to ethanol in Iowa and tried to look at what the potential would be to develop an industry based on that. And there are 3 points that I don't want to go into the details, although I'd be happy to discuss how we did it. But there are 3 points that I wanted to make. Valerie mentioned one of them. There are economies of size on the conversion side. There are very much diseconomies of size on the feedstock side. And so what you see here is for the 3 different feedstock levels, the delivered cost of the feedstock is very different on it because they have to go between these plants. They have to go to transport it farther different distances, and they have to go to higher cost producers. So you wind up having one that they're facing. Large plants face a higher feedstock cost than the smaller plants. So it's a combination of the two that you need to look at. 2, the early bird gets the worm, basically. So the first plants that come online can get the cheapest feedstock and lock it in. Next guys coming down the line now are going to have to go out here, go much farther afield and, again, look at more expensive feedstock supply. So if you are in a situation where you have multiple facilities that are being built in the same geographic area, this is the kind of scenario you're going to be looking at. 3rd, almost every analysis that you're going to see that's out there, including our own, makes an average assumption. It's a lot of variability that's going to go on, not only from year to year. And as I noted, we're operating on 100% of the feedstocks being collected and used. And there are farmers out there, there are forestry owners that I don't care how much you pay them. They are not going to provide the feedstock, and they are not going to participate. You just have to recognize that reality. And you need to recognize how that changes your price structure that you're going to have. The last thing I want to do is just competition for land. All of the energy crops are going to, that are being discussed, it is true, they are not food crops. So you do not have competition in the end-use market. But you do compete for the land to produce these crops on. So there is that interaction going on. And I'm not going to go through all of this again. The one thing I want to point out to you is the soybean price on it. And the rationale here, and what's important here is, again, you do not necessarily operate in a vacuum. You're not an island in and of yourself. And so you can't just say, well, I'm a biodiesel producer using soybeans, and hey, there's a whole new market developing out there using switchgrass for electricity. It's irrelevant to me. Wrong. It's very relevant to you because you're going to be facing, if that market develops significantly, maybe facing a situation where you have a lot less feedstock available and the cost to you is a lot higher than you expected. Even though the action is occurring in other regions, other sectors, other markets than your particular market. So you need to recognize those kinds of dynamic interactions. I can close it right there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Nathan?
Sure. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about forests and energy and represent the forests of the state of Georgia, which means I'm representing the forest landowners of the state of Georgia as well, and which also will extend into the South and maybe the rest of the country. I'm going to be focusing on forests in particular, forest biomass that can come from forest management areas, not trees that are planted like in a short rotation woody crop scenario. So my comments will be based specifically dealing with forest and forest management. I'm going to talk first a little bit to give some background information on the forests of Georgia and the southern forest, and then talk a little more specifically about the forest industry and how bioenergy or biomass can be used within the forest industry and the growth of forests in the state in a combination or in a combined manner. And then I'm going to address sustainability a little bit at the end. Looking at forests, I use the word timberlands. Sometimes I talk about forests, but timberlands usually in a lot of the data and data structures that we have indicate forest lands that do not have a legal restriction on harvesting or removing material. So if there's some major restriction on harvesting, the acreage will not be included in the data that I use. Looking across the country, if you look at the top 10 states in this graph on the upper left of the slide, the top 10 states that have timberland, Georgia, you will see, it's a surprise to many, it's number one. We've been number two with Oregon for a while, but recently we've gained some forest through some planting on agricultural land. So Georgia actually has more timberlands than any other state in the nation. And if you look at the chart, both of the charts at the top, you will see the dark color there is for privately owned timberland. And it's very important to look at ownership in timberland for availability. And the lighter color is publicly owned land. So the graph on the right are the top 10 states of privately owned timberland in the country. And you will see that 6 of those states are actually in the South. And if you throw in Arkansas and Missouri, you've got 8 of the 10 there in the country that have timberland. So the South does have quite a potential to produce biomass in the state. And the pie chart there is specific to Georgia. You look at the ownership, the individuals actually own 58% of the timberland in the state of Georgia. So it's not a huge industry presence anymore for the forest industry. They've sold their lands to other entities across through the last 15 or 20 years, and so it's corporately owned, and those corporations not involved specifically with forest industry mills, and privately owned, and the total is 24.4 million acres. Another slide on forest, and this is specific to Georgia. The bar chart here shows the volume, or I guess it would actually be weight. This is oven dry weight of biomass in trees by diameter class, beginning with a 1 to 3 inch class at the far left. You'll see those tall green bars represent pine trees. The different colors of bars represent different species groups of trees. And you will see that we have a lot of small diameter pine in the state of Georgia, and that's the way our forests are managed and the way they grow naturally, in fact. The pie chart shows the specific types of forest and doesn't really relate exactly with the bar chart, because these are the forests as they're classified by the trees that are there. We have about 7 million acres of planted pine in the state of Georgia, which means that those areas are very productive areas for forest volume and wood volume. Natural pine's about 4 million acres, and that's about 45% of our timberlands. We've got about 40% in hardwood, so we're actually about split even, and then the remainder is timberlands that can be classified as a mixed species group. Looking at the way forests are typically managed, the pine forests, and this is really all across the South. I've thrown up sort of a case sample. This is the way that landowners typically manage land if they're planting trees. They plant trees and they'll thin them either 1 or 2 times and then have a final harvest. And I've proposed this sample here where they may thin their trees at 15 years, and at that time they're going to harvest small diameter trees. The trees are going to be only 15 years old. They're going to be small diameter. Most of that wood's going to be pulpwood or trees that go to small uses like posts, or OSB, oriented strand board products. And then the next thinning is going to remove a lot of pulpwood as well. But it's also going to remove some small logs that are sawtimber logs. And then the final harvest, somewhere around 30 to 35 years, you're going to remove a significant amount of larger trees and larger logs, although you're also going to remove a few small trees, pulpwood-sized trees. And at each harvest, you're also going to have available logging residues, tops and branches for those trees. What I want to point out are the numbers in the box. And the amount there that you see, those are the actual our average production levels of a pine stand on an average site in Georgia by the different products. And that's an average per year in green tons. And look at the values. The values actually in parentheses are what I call typical values over the past 10 years. The values that aren't in parentheses are what we see in the last few months. We've had some different things going on with the economy and that type of thing. But regardless of which numbers you look at, you will see that those small diameter trees, which are pulpwood, and the logging residues, the value there would have to triple or maybe even up to 5 times. You'd have to multiply those numbers up to 5 times to compete with those large saw timber. So the value of those small diameter trees are much lower. So biomass is going to use pulpwood and logging residues. And these are dollars per green ton. You would just about double that to get your dollars per dry ton that you saw in the previous presentation. I want to go over now the way the infrastructure is within the forest industry, starting with the forest landowners, which we've already saw are mostly privately held, and just go through this chart to help us understand what the supply chain is like for biomass coming from forests. At the top, you'll see that these private landowners own the trees and the biomass, but they sell trees to brokers or timber suppliers or timber purchasing and harvesting. They're almost a middleman. This is the typical application now. And then the broker there will divide up the trees between product classes, and I've simplified it quite a bit. Sometimes you might have as many as 8 or 10 or even more product classes coming from the same piece of property during a timber harvesting operation. But I've simplified it into small trees or small roundwood and large roundwood. And the small roundwood is going to go to pulp mills or OSB mills. The large roundwood is going to go to sawmills or perhaps plywood mills. And at the sawmills, you're going to have residues produced, bark, sawdust, shavings, clean chips from the slabbing around the edge of the logs. The residues already have products, as we've heard. They're byproducts that can be used for a variety of things like mulch, particle board, other products. The clean chips normally go to pulp mills, and the pulp mills use those just like they do the pulpwood to make whatever product they're making, like the liner board. Now, let's see how we can look at this complete industry and system and integrate a bioenergy industry into this, and what might happen as this bioenergy industry develops. Starting at the top, just to make it simple, forest landowners now, if the market exists for this material, they have an opportunity to do thinning of trees to actually improve their forest. When these trees are small, maybe their forest is too dense, they can remove a part of the trees to allow the residual trees to grow more. And then they actually have a market for that. It's not a cost item for them. Also, fuel reduction treatments remove material to prevent damage from wildfire. And then the logging residues that are currently not used. That's an additional product that they could sell. And then the next arrow down is going to be some of the competition that we've heard about. The small roundwood or pulpwood can be used also because the price is within the level that bioenergy markets can utilize. And I know that Valerie mentioned the biorefinery concept earlier, and I've placed that there. I think there's a great opportunity for pulp mills to actually be biorefineries, and not necessarily just for electricity, but also for biofuels, and I think we're going to hear about that maybe a little later. But also some of the residues from the sawmills may be diverted as well to some of the energy uses. And I've just listed all those energy uses that on the right. Some of them can use part of this material, and some of them have restrictions on exactly what material they can use. Now moving on to sustainability, and to me sustainability means the supply of material into the future, and it also means the environmental integrity of the system that you're using. Looking at supply, and this is going to be probably some repeat information, but I think some of the information comes from a different source. But this is specific to Georgia. You will see that the green and blue and yellow, the bottom part of the slide, is the actual wood that is used over the past, from 95 to 2007 for different traditional forest products. The red line at the top is the amount of wood that has been grown in the forest in Georgia, on the timberlands in Georgia. And if you look at merchantable wood, that's actually, the difference is actually 19 million green tons. There's a little bit more difference here on the chart because it actually includes some trees that were removed from sites and not used for products. So there's a little bit of a difference, but you can see that there's quite a difference there. In other words, our growth exceeds our removals, and this is just another slide to show the same thing. Right in the middle of the slide, you'll see the 38%. That shows that we are the average between 1998 and 2008. Our forest in Georgia grew 38% more than the removals were within those forests. And you see the different species groups that are there. Pines were 32%, and hardwoods are also positive. The chart on the right shows the relationship between growth and removals and the total inventory on those timberlands of wood. So it just gives you an idea of what's there. We have done an assessment of what's available in Georgia as far as residues go within the state based on several assumptions using forest inventory and analysis data that we collect, as well as some other data sources. And I'm not going to go through all these, but there are certain assumptions there that are listed. But the numbers that I've come up with are over 18 million green tons, which at a 50% moisture content, interestingly enough, is 9 million green tons. And I think it was 8 point something that we saw in the last presentation for Georgia. So those numbers really are pretty close, even though the analysis, I'm sure, were done differently. At the bottom, you'll see we also have that 19 million green tons of additional wood that we're growing that's not included as residues. And also the mill residues that I have not included in my analysis that are produced are 14.6 million green tons per year. Most of them are all used, but economics may divert those to a bioenergy plant. And looking at all the companies that we expect to build plants in the next 5 years, we're looking at somewhere between 10 and 12 million tons of needed material. If the plants that we have talked with all build their plants, the ones that have made significant advancements in permitting and investments and those types of things. So you can see, you can compare what's needed and what we have there available just in the residues. And looking at sustainability and supply, really what we need to look at is not just the state, not just the South, but we need to look locally. In forestry, sustainability is a local issue. So we do assessments of local areas for plants, and each particular company needs to look at this in specific to a specific geographic area. I'll go through this pretty quick. If we do an analysis of what might be available based on the potential of the land to grow trees, the pine plantations, if you focus on the orange in the middle, and I know this is similar to a slide I had before, the average site, say, grows close to 7 green tons per acre per year without a lot of extra intensive culture. And the general rule of thumb with our naturally regenerated forests is that production's about half of what our planted forests are. So just looking at our pine lands in the state, you remember they're about 45% of the state's timberlands. If you multiply the numbers on the bottom right there, you'll see that we can produce about 69 million green tons of material. And our annual removals now are around 50. And those numbers really line up pretty well with the chart that we saw just very previously. So even looking at the growth potential method of analyzing what our biomass production could be, the numbers still look pretty close to the same, and they are positive. And the idea is that we can increase our growth rates. If we increase our culture, we can gain more, not just the culture, but also the trees that we're planting with the tree improvement practices that we're going through our genetics programs. Okay, this is one point that I need to make, and I always put this in most of my presentations, and sustainability of supply is not just what's out there, not just what could be grown biologically, but it also implies that there is a relationship between the value of the material and what the owners of the forest and the land may do. And the lines that you see here are costs or values of stumpage for various products, forest products, over the past 20 years or so. And the bars represent the acres planted in trees in the state of Georgia. And you can see there's a pretty close relationship with the ups and downs as we go through. So the price of the market in the marketplace of pulpwood, as well as these other products, influences how many trees are planted. So there's actually a market influence to supply. And what we want to do is increase this tree planting. So. Now looking at the environmental integrity of issue of sustainability, I went ahead and threw in the big word that I hear a lot from some of our groups that are interested in environmental issues, conversion. And it gets to the land use issue again. And my point on conversion is we need to define it. If we're changing from forest use to ag use or ag use to forest use, those are changing land uses. That's conversion. Perhaps if we're planting an exotic species that's not native to our area, perhaps that could be considered conversion. But just because we're planting native trees, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a land conversion. And that's in some of the policy issues now that we're dealing with. I think it may have more to do with management intensity than it does with just planting trees. And that's some of the issues that we're trying to wrestle with policy now. Georgia has best management practices, or BMPs, for forestry. They've been working very well. And the compliance rate, the last compliance survey was in 2007. The compliance rates were in the 90s for almost every practice across the state, where these are things like, do you leave a streamside management zone when you harvest? Do you retire roads using water bars and stabilizing sites after harvest? Those types of things. And so we have those in place, and they actually address harvest that might involve biomass pretty well, because our forest harvest, especially in the southern part of the state, are fairly intensive now, our planting and our harvesting. The culture is intensive. It may not be a lot different than what we would do with biomass. So those BMPs are working pretty well. However, we realize that there's some issues that may need to be added to those, and the water quality is covered, we think. But soil productivity, maybe some issues with forest health and wildlife and biodiversity are things that we can add to those. And actually, the forest health issue is positive, because those are things that if we remove fuels from underneath those pine stands in South Georgia, perhaps we won't have wildfires that will destroy the forest. So it would really, the fuel reduction issue, the thinning issue would really help. The soil productivity issue is something that we really need to look at and make sure that we're leaving enough material to maintain soils. The wildlife and biodiversity issue is one I think that's the most debated right now, and where we need to really get together and decide how to handle that. The other thing that we need to remember is that biomass markets actually provide some beneficial management tools. We can remove exotic plants like privet. Perhaps that can be used as a fuel, and people are really wanting to remove Chinese privet from their property. We can do the thinnings that are beneficial for wildlife. So those things are beneficial. In summary, I think southern timberlands do have quite a potential to produce energy, not only from the residues, but from the small diameter trees. And I think the bioenergy industry will be part of the forest industry. It won't be something new. It is very much like our industry that we have now in the supply chain. I think it's going to be part of the industry. However, just like our industry is today, it's going to use a low-value product. I don't think it will influence the way that we grow trees. We will continue to grow trees for higher-value products like saw timber. In other words, we're going to grow trees to be larger. In the process, we're going to harvest some smaller trees. We do have the BMPs that can be covered. The conversion issue, biodiversity, and things like private landowner rights, these are some sticking points that are a little different as we go through to address during policy development and in some of the regulations that we have. And I skipped the one because I wanted to make a point here. we think that, and the reason actually that we have the program that we have now specific to this, to biomass and forestry within the Georgia Forestry Commission, is we think it's a positive thing, and we think that the extra value there will drive landowners to better manage their lands and will result in more forest and not less. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you about this joint venture to take all this research around what you do with forest biomass and how do you get into the market, particularly in terms of going to liquid transportation fuels. So first of all, quick entry on our joint venture. So what is it? It is a 50-50 joint venture between Chevron and Weyerhaeuser, who of course are two very long-standing, very competent natural resource companies. So our mission in particular is to really get through the research phase. We're not just a research shop, but to commercialize at large scale production of liquid transportation fuels. So there's lots of different markets to take biomass to. One very large market with a lot of opportunity and value is liquid transportation fuels. So forest to fuel is kind of our name. There's a very large base of forestry type feedstocks, as you've been hearing about this morning. And so we are researching, developing, commercializing both ourselves and also through our partners. This is a little schematic of our what we call the end-to-end value chain. And we're pretty unique as a company in that a lot of the players in this budding industry participate in one part or another, from the front to the middle to the back end. And what's unique about our joint venture is we participate end-to-end completely. So for example, if we talked about growing energy crops on Weyerhaeuser Timberland, our joint venture would actually own the energy crop, own the seeds. Weyerhaeuser would provide services to us to help grow the crop, but then we would take it all the way through the hauling, the collection, the conversion, and the production and distribution. And at the end of our value chain, then likely our advanced biofuels would be taken into the Chevron network. Drivers for the joint venture, I'm sure you're all aware of lots of policy around sustainable renewable energy, energy independence and security, and of course a value proposition for the two parent companies. In terms of, for Weyerhaeuser, it's are there other ways to get value off of the timberlands, taking biomass to other markets other than traditional lumber products? And for Chevron, very important to meet the renewables fuel standard for advanced biofuels. So in particular for our joint venture, our goals, sustainability we talked about, and we have a lot of sustainability research underway in many of the different aspects that Nathan talked about. Conversion technology, again, both internal and external. We are starting in North America, if we can really prove it out in North America, and in particularly in the southeast, which is really where the heart of the biomass opportunity is. Fast-growing region, pretty level terrain for growing and accessing the biomass. And then our model is build, own, operate. Challenges are certainly there across the board. The new and evolving biofuels markets. The renewable fuel standard is really set by the federal government as what created this market. It's still the demand pool. Regulatory uncertainty, some of that was lessened recently with the final regulations that came out around RFS2. But there is a rapid ramp-up requirement, which is the challenge in this business, is getting it to scale. It's all about scale and lots of capital to get it to scale. You've seen the numbers in the other presenter slides. You're talking about millions of acres and tens of millions of tons annually. You have to have sustainability. Conversion processes, they're making a lot of headway, a lot of progress, but they're still not completely proven out in economic at scale. A lot of that depends, of course, on what's the energy price at the end of the day. Roughly speaking, if we're at a sort of today's $70 per barrel crude oil world, then these things are starting to come into range. But even there, they probably need some of the credits that are in place right now, 45, 50 cents a gallon. If those went away, then you'd have to notch up, another $20 a barrel crude to really begin to draw these things into the market. This is just a picture I'm sure lots of you have seen before. This is the standard, the federal requirement. The blue area here is really the cellulosic, which is what my joint venture is involved in. All of the yellow base or foundation for renewables is around corn ethanol. But this new industry for advanced biofuels is really the blue, the green, and the red here, and the blue is the big area, the opportunity area for my joint venture. I won't go through these numbers. You've seen them in the other presentations. It's just there is a lot of opportunity there, but the challenge is around how many acres you're going to draw on. And ultimately, if you talk about converting into fuels, you can see to meet the federal standard towards the bottom of the slide here, you'd actually need like something like 160 commercial facilities. The capital requirements, if these things roughly are going to cost $500 million each, which is very expensive, that's a lot of money. And so one of the big questions in this is, so who is funding these things? So you have to have a value proposition that works from end to end that's going to draw in investors. So particularly at the front end for our joint venture, the feedstock strategy is forest-based, naturally building on one of my two parents' core competency, forestry base. And Weyerhaeuser has 6 million acres in the U.S., 4 million of it is in the southeast in this prime area that was referenced earlier. One of the interesting new twists that we're doing with our venture is actually not just talking about forest residuals, but actually growing energy crops like a switchgrass on the timberlands. Because the way Weyerhaeuser practices forestry, there's enough spacing between the trees, and I'll show you some pictures quickly here, that you can actually conceive of growing an energy crop along with timber. So why forest-based? Again, it's in place. There's a lot of expertise there at moving forestry biomass right now into various industries like pulp and paper mill. There's a lot of science, efficiency in harvesting, a sustainability proposition. So if you talk about trying to get this industry started and sustainability aspect of security of supply, well, there's a lot of that in place already. So forestry makes a lot of sense to initially ramp up and get this industry going. So this is just a little map. You can see the southeast acreage that Weyerhaeuser has, and actually some pictures of the forest. And you can see the spacing and some of the understory that naturally grows in on the forest land. And here's some, oops, go back up here. Some thoughts on adapting the forestry strategy. Again, not just saw timber, but taking biomass to other uses. Here's the intercropping is the term we sort of invented for putting energy crops in the forest. And the pictures you see here are actually plantings we have underway. Our joint venture actually has over 2,000 acres of switchgrass planted on timberlands. So we're doing a lot of research on there, both for sustainability and how do you scale this thing up to complement a forest residual strategy. So this opportunity is really doubling the efficiency, if you will, for what you can get off of forest land by doing energy crops in conjunction with woody growth. Feedstock sources, of course, as you saw on the other slides, it's many different things: residuals, understories, thinnings, residuals, and for us, intercropping. Sustainability research, there's many different aspects of this. We view sustainability as foundational for the whole proposition that if you can't prove sustainability, then you're out of business or you'll never get into business. So yes, we have a lot of scientists working on all the aspects here to prove out it is a good sustainable proposition. Soils, nutrients, wildlife, water, carbon life cycle, all of that study is underway, and I think making very good progress. Conversion technology will be huge then for once you get this biomass hopefully efficiently delivered to a conversion plant. What do you do with it? And that's where we start to draw on the capabilities of our Chevron parent in converting biomass into fuels. The bioproducts, ethanol, of course, has a long history. People know how to make ethanol, and that's where the early work and the early delivery will probably be. But what the industry at the tail end really wants to fit the existing infrastructure is hydrocarbons, things like diesel and gasoline and even jet fuel. So our venture will probably get into both areas, ethanol earlier, hydrocarbons maybe a few years after, and using multiple technologies. It's still early, so we don't know which of these platforms of biological, thermochemical, or chemical catalytic type approaches are going to work. I think it's going to be a little bit of a regional play. Each area will have a little different feedstock, a little bit different optimum conversion cycle, and what products are needed at the tail end. Logistics and infrastructure throughout this chain is hugely important. People like to think simply of just biomass conversion and product. But what links it all together is this logistics and infrastructure, and it is not automatic. It is not easy. There could be a lot of cost involved here, a new infrastructure that has to be set up to make this go. So some of the key learnings, we've been at it for 2 years now. We started in February 2008. Yes, there's lots of excitement, and for ourselves and a lot of other players, we're really committed to drive this forward and make it happen. But it won't be as quick as thought. It's certainly not just the technology. It's it's scale-up issues, it's logistics, it's economics, it's policy propositions. All the different variables that come into really establishing a commercial business come into play. Some things are out of our control. Energy pricing at the tail end is hugely volatile. If you got crude oil going from 70 to 140 to 50 to back to 70, that really affects the market into which ultimately these fuels get delivered. It won't be a single technology. Hydrocarbons I talked about. You've heard this morning as well about competition for forest resources. There's going to be a lot of that. Then that's going to shake up the playing field for everybody who's drawing on forestry biomass. And kind of close with the thought here that the strength we have in this is because of where we came from. We deal with a lot of venture capital companies, but in our case, I've got two parents with an established background and competency, and hopefully the funding wherewithal to really stand behind this venture when we can offer up some very compelling propositions. So I'm going to pause there, allow some time for questions.
All right, anybody who has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll come around and bring you the microphone.
Hi, I have a question for the last speaker. I was wondering, you mentioned government policy was one of the uncertainties, and I was wondering what you meant by that, because there is a renewable fuel standard requiring a certain amount of ethanol by 2022, which seems pretty certain, but I'd like your perspective.
Yes, thanks for the question. I'm supposed to be repeating the questions, I guess, for people on the webcast, but quickly it was around, is there really regulatory uncertainty when in fact there is an RFS2 standard and recent regulations? And yes, there is, and yet there's enough. If you peel the onion and get down into the details in terms of exactly what types, how much of biomass really will qualify as renewable is still some gray area there. In terms of how you qualify into the different categories, uncertainties around qualifying your particular conversion process by the EPA is some gray area. And I'd say probably my biggest illusion to uncertainty was around the credits actually for producing advanced biofuels. So for example, there's $1.01 per gallon right now, which expires in 2012. Those sorts of credits, if you will, $50 or $1 a gallon, are huge. They're absolutely huge in terms of driving the economics of these projects. So whether they're there, they go away, are they there for a 15 or 20-year project makes a big difference.
I have a question for Valerie on the true cost of coal and the true cost of our electricity. This month's issue of Engineering News Record had an article about the real cleanup cost of the Kingston, Tennessee coal ash spill, which is about $1.2 billion. And Georgia has, I think, between 10 and 15 coal ash sludge ponds. If the cost of that liability was incorporated into the actual cost of coal, do you know what our real cost of energy would be? And also, I believe the oil industry is required to record those liabilities on their balance sheets for environmental cleanup, and I don't think utilities are required. So again, if that was required, do you know what our real costs would be?
Thank you. That's a great question. And just to repeat briefly, the question is basically that I showed just market prices, and to partially answer your question, no, that didn't include the real cost. It did not include the cost of cleaning up the coal ash ponds. It did not include any of the externalities that are not yet priced into our energy system. If the externalities were included, the costs of coal would be larger.
Hi, this question is also for Valerie. On your next to the last slide, how did you come up with the calculations of converting and from power plant conversion to biomass? The ranges were anywhere from 0% to 100% depending on the locale. On your next to the last slide, you had conversions from plants that would produce biomass energy, ranging from 0% to anywhere to 100%, depending on the locale and the power plant.
Yes, thank you. The question was, in fact, now I remember, the next to the last slide that I showed. What that was are plants in Georgia that are producing electricity from biomass. And those data come from the US EPA, EGRID, I believe. I think there's someone in the audience that might have helped me with that. So those figures are showing what those specific plants are actually producing today. So it doesn't cover what they could potentially produce. And I think that the percentages shown are just the fraction of the energy used at those plants that's biomass as opposed to coal or some other source. So there's more potential out there.
This question is for the speaker from Tennessee. I have two things. One is you gave a number for electricity consumption overall, which is around 4,000 terawatt hours, and yet your numbers for the biomass biofuel production were based on 2025 or 2020 numbers, which would actually take that number up to around 5,000 terawatt hours. So hopefully, or presumably, the percentage, 18%, which you said was kind of what was producible by biofuel on a sustained basis, would actually be lower, would probably be more like 14 or 15%. And the second part of this question is if that is the physical limit that you're seeing on a sustainable basis, and it only applies to having all the biofuel go towards electricity production, yet the second part of the discussion was really about biofuels for transportation, is there a combined limit, or is this just for electricity and the biofuels for transportation can be done separately?
Okay, this is a two-part question here. The first part is kind of my estimates of projected electricity demand, and I will say that is a real simple projection. There was not, I wasn't able to find real fast projected production at the state level for 2020. EIA has projections for total U.S. It's about an 8% increase in generation between 2008 and 2020. So I just did an 8% is what that is. So take it with a little grain of salt on doing that. The other question you have is, to me, one of the central questions that are the people at University of Tennessee and I are trying to get at, is that, in fact, most of the analysis that you see, the policy that's out there kind of says, oh, well, I've got biofuels being produced and it's in isolation. I've got bioelectricity being produced, it's in isolation. Nobody looks at the bioproducts, but they're also coming online. The question really comes is that you've got all of these coming online simultaneously. And when we do the analysis, you kind of have to build in the existing policies that were available at the time. And since most of our analysis, ethanol was out there, electricity policies were not, what we found almost all of the biomass would go to the fields and not to the electricity sector. But even when you kind of back off on that, in general, the electricity is a lower value use than the fields. And so it tends to go more to the field side than it does to the electricity. There certainly is a lot more work that needs to be done on those kinds of trade-offs that does not take into consideration any kind of environmental externalities, carbon type things. So there may be some additional factors that kind of shift that around, but in general, it tends to, when you try to compare them simultaneously, it goes to the fields as opposed to the electricity because it's a higher value from a strictly economic type perspective based on our assumptions of what the yields and the costs are going to look like. And that's, you know, as everybody in this group has said, those are kind of big unknowns for a lot of these. But yeah, based on that, electricity tends to lose out compared to the fields. So.
Let's see, I'd like to continue with another question for Marie Walsh, but it also relates to Valerie and Mike Burnside's talks, also sort of how the three all fit together. Marie, did you consider the intercropping opportunity in your assessment? I'm just wondering off the cuff if you have any sort of order of magnitude assessment of what kind of a difference that might make. And then the other, relating to Valerie's talk, she discussed the combined heat and power production at pulp and paper sites around Georgia or the country, and I didn't see that in your estimate of bio-based power production either. I have read that the going in EIA estimates are that that's a very small opportunity, and yet I keep hearing about examples, as Valerie brought up, of actual plants where it appears to be quite viable and significant.
Okay, again, this is a two-part question. First of all, did I look at, I tend to call it agroforestry. It's been referred to here as intercropping. No, we have not. I think it's a fascinating option. I think there are a lot of things that we can do if we think outside the box a little bit, and I would like to look at some of those kinds of options. The question that I do have is that yes, the spacing is wide enough to get the equipment in, but it's still a fairly narrow spacing between it. And getting your movement, it tends to increase your cost under that production as opposed to a big field. So I think your cost structure may be a little bit higher in that kind of a system than just a big standard field, but it certainly uses some of that space that's not being used currently. And so that may be a nice option. I would really like to see that. With respect to the electricity demand, I have to admit, my background is biochemistry and economics. And I'm comfortable with the bioproducts, I'm comfortable with the field. I'm not so comfortable with the electricity, which you probably saw it got a little bit of short shift there, on how to actually make those kinds of conversions. Again, there is a possibility, of course, most of the paper and pulp industry is already producing about, 50-60% of their electricity comes from their resources. And I know their 2020 goal was to make it 100%, that they were going to be completely self-efficient. So there is some opportunities that would require going to like a gasification instead of the Tomlinson boilers. So a different technology than what they've got. Most of the stuff that we've looked at has been co-firing, particularly in the southeast, as opposed to a dedicated facility, because I guess I'm kind of thinking that's your first opportunity. It's the low-hanging fruit in the southeast as to what people would do, and so that's mostly what I've looked at. So I'm on shaky ground when I get into electricity. I'm sorry. So.
I might just add one more quick perspective from someone trying to get into the business. The shared infrastructure one is an interesting one with a pro and a con, I guess. If you can find mill owners who have enough underutilized capacity, it's a nice way to fill it out and utilize the site and save some of the cost for infrastructure for a biorefinery. On the other hand, if they think they're going to go back to full utilization, then they don't really welcome the additional draw on the biomass, so instantly you get back to the competition for the biomass. So.
Related to the production question and the intercropping, my assessment, and most all of the assessments that you see that are based on forestry production of biomass, are based on history, based on the traditional way of doing things, and also based on residues. A lot of it's just residues. If we have a market for this material, the silviculture or the cultural practices in forestry could significantly change, and we could produce higher levels per acre. And I think, you know, not just for the intercropping, but things like producing more or planting more trees per acre, thinning those trees earlier. Those types of practices will produce actually more biomass per acre. So the production could go up just in the traditional forestry and not just in dedicated energy crops.
All right, I think we have time for one more question from the web.
Actually, could I get 2 questions in, please? So we have some interesting questions, some pragmatic questions from our listeners over the web. The first question is, so I've heard a lot about cellulosic ethanol. When am I going to see it at the pump?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of players in this industry, and there's a lot of talk already out there around, well, we have commercial production, but it's really tiny scale. These are really demonstration plants. They're very, very small commercial plants. So what I call truly commercial scale is at least 50 million gallons a year, and better more like 100 million or even 150 million, sort of what you see out of corn ethanol. So to truly see cellulosic ethanol at scale getting through the marketing and distribution system, I sort of think 2012, 2013 is when you're going to start to see that. And there was recognition of this recently in the revised final regs of RFS2. The goal for cellulosic was 100 million gallons this year in the standard, and recently recognized that the capacity isn't there, so it was dropped to 6.5 million gallons. So we're still, a handful of years away from starting to see introduction at scale.
The second question is presumably from a landowner. So when am I going to see an uplift, this is paraphrasing, but when am I going to see an uplift in the stumpage value of my timber based on what the presentations have described?
That's for you.
Well, I can start out there, but I mean, there's other speakers to address some of the other markets. Again, for transportation fuel, putting an extra draw on the biomass at scale, I think that's still 4 to 5 years away. Some of the other uses, such as green power, pellets, are already starting to put pressure on the biomass, I believe. So in terms of a reflection back on the stumpage rate, I think you'll start to see that pretty soon. It's a bit of a catch-22. I mean, as the stumpage rate goes up, that's just one aspect of the whole value chain, which when you take it to the end product, makes it more difficult to gain entry into the market. So, but I really think sort of starting now and for the next few years, you should be able to start to see the stumpage rates rising.
My answer is it depends. And mainly it depends on where you are. Everything's local in the forest industry and in the bioenergy industry. If you're in an area that traditionally has not had good markets for small diameter wood, not near a pulp and paper mill, and you have a biomass plant like a pellet mill or an electricity plant that may build in your area, as soon as it's operational, you're going to see an increase in stumpage. Just a historical case study in northeast Georgia back in the 80s, there was no market for small diameter pine. Within about an 8-month period, we had 2 OSB mills come into northeast Georgia. The stumpage price went from $6 per ton to $12 per ton in less than a year. So that's just sort of what happened in one instance where you had about a 1 million ton per year increase in an area where there was not much competition.
Just going to add one more quick thought from a market standpoint. We sort of call it the conundrum, but it's a little bit of chicken egg, what comes first. So it's going to be hard to enter into contracts arrangements that try to roll up all of this biomass if there's not a conversion plant out there yet. And then if you're trying to put in an appropriation and request and build a conversion plant, you're not going to do that until the feedstock's in place. So it's kind of pull each other up together. It's not just automatically one or the other.
This question's for Nathan. I grew up in the carbon business, you might say. My father was a chemical engineer and dealt with the international sugar industry in biomass and also bioorganics for 45 years. And your presentation confused me in that I didn't realize that Georgia was the leading state almost in the country in biomass production. And with my background, it's very clear that photosynthesis is a very important part of biomass production. We have, trusted officials in the state and legislators in the state that have been quoted on the record, especially Stan Weiser, Public Service Commissioner, as stating that we don't have enough sunshine in Georgia to support solar. But I find it interesting that we do have enough sunshine to be one of the biggest producers of biomass in the United States. I just wanted to see if you could respond to that.
The numbers that I was showing are real numbers. They're true numbers of timberland acreage and the growth of the wood that we have, or the growth of the trees that we have. You also realize that we have almost the largest forest products industry in the country. In the South, we produce 2/3 of the forest products for the country, just in a few states in the South. So there's another industry that's also using a lot of the material that's valuable. It's valuable for that industry. So the way this thing's going to play out is this is just another part of that industry, and it will all depend on the economics and how that works out in the end. But one of the things that we have seen recently is that sometimes policy doesn't work as well as we would like it to work. Even when it's incentives to do good things, sometimes the thoughts are not. I don't know if you're familiar with the BCAP program, but it's something that the rules are changing right now. There's a comment period on BCAP, which is a payment to delivers or owners of biomass to energy facilities, and that program is sort of confused the whole infrastructure a little bit. So I think we're going to see policy going forward maybe having a little more thought put into the way the policy is structured to encourage biomass. But I agree. I think this area of the country, specifically Georgia, we have a great opportunity to take advantage of this. And I was talking earlier this morning about the pulp and paper industry, how they're very strong as well in the South and in Georgia. But if the pulp and paper industry really wants to, they can take the opportunity to also invest in this industry. And I think we can see that as a real positive for Georgia, that we do have that infrastructure in place. And I think we'll see that. It's just going to take some time.
Well, it's 1:45. We've intentionally run overtime a little bit because we started late. Let's please thank our distinguished speakers for presenting today. And I would just bring your attention once again to the website, secleanenergy.org. The presentations are posted already, and by Friday morning we'll have the webcast posted. So thank you very much for being here.